Now, I want you to look at this because this is so descriptive. Now, first, I'll preface it by saying I'm not a big fan of animal studies, although Anna Marie and I went up and spent a week at a genetics conference at the Jackson Laboratory in Maine about 5 years ago. And we were quite interested because that laboratory creates the premier, the perfect, the contouring animals that they use for this research. And I went as far, if you know my personality, why, to actually interview the man that invented those little mice. And I feel bad for them, but on the other hand, they do use these in research. Now look where it says wild mice. Wild mice means people who are living the way that they did 100, 500, 1,000 years ago. And if you remember, we said 1850 to 2050. And we said America sort of led the way not to live like we did 100, 200, 300, 500 years ago. And other countries are just beginning to, and they haven't fallen yet. And some countries have done it a little less than we have, and they've fallen somewhat. Well, look at here. Here's living proof of. And I say living. Now, many of you out there that really don't know a whole lot about biology are going to say, well, these are mice. They're not human beings. I don't want to let you know this, but genetically, you're very close to a mice. And by the way, there's something that's even more funny to me. A fruit fly is like 98% genetically identical to us. So look at the wild mice there. And what I just articulated, I explained to you about the immune system being turned on from serotonin in the T cell response, going back and forth with proteins that are the communication device. It actually creates an attack on the bad guy coming in. Now, the sterilized mice, look what happens. There's no attack. So there's no communication at all. So the end result, one mice runs away and goes to the mice colony again and has fun and lives a long life, and the other mice basically die. I don't know how much more clear we can be on this. And you can always reference every study that I'm seeing. And by the way, out of dozens or 100 studies it took to put this program together, I've only selected a handful. Antibiotics. I said something sort of good about them before, but now we're going to say because they're overused, misused, and prolonged used, we have problems with them. I love the word anti-infectives. That's what they're supposed to be. And boy, when they invented them by mistake, by the way, how many of you remember the story of how they discovered antibiotics? There was a guy messing around with mold on bread. It was probably white bread. And by the way, what happened? He said, well, there's something in there when I look at my microscope that seems to be attacking this bacteria that's on my Petri dish. And he was really a bright guy, obviously, and he started to mess with it, and he created something we call penicillin. And again, it has saved so many people's lives because bacterial disease was the number one cause of death. Microbial disease was the #1 cause of death. And very, very, very few people died of lifestyle diseases. They were non-existent. The only people that had lifestyle diseases were the aristocracy. They were the ones who were sick and overweight. And they used to think it was because they were interbreeding. Now they realize it was the elite lifestyle they were living that all of us looked up at them and said, oh, when we get a few dollars in our pocket, we want to mimic them. And that's exactly what happened. Remember, 100 years ago, hardly anyone ate meat. Nobody ate processed food. Everything was 100% organic. That's a fact, not an opinion. So antibiotics are different from all other drugs. They not only affect the individual to whom they are given, but also all other life forms they interact with. So if you're hugging and kissing or loving somebody, by the way, that has taken an antibiotic, that's going to be transferred to you. Just like chemotherapy, any legitimate, and I quote, legitimate oncologist is going to tell somebody who's taken radiation or chemotherapy not to get close to or sleep in the bed with somebody for quite a period of time until that wanes and goes down a little bit. So this is something that's so pervasive, used so widely, that we cannot escape this. As clean of a lifestyle that I live, I'm sure when I'm taking a shower, in a hotel that doesn't have a filter on the shower, I'm contracting some of this. Because one of the great vehicles of contracting antibiotics, besides taking it directly, is getting it in water, but worse than that is through animals. Antibiotics and disease. Now, there are significant volumes of data now on everything I'm going to talk about. Studies found or done on young people literally show that what we know is that obesity is increased when they've taken antibiotics. So yeah, eating bad food and fast food make our children chubby. But guess what? The ones who have taken antibiotics are even more chubby and have a much more difficult time maintaining homeostasis or balance. Type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Data is clear. Inflammatory bowel disease. This was something we saw in rare cases with young men in their early 20s. Just last week, I dealt with a 9-year-old with an inflammatory bowel disease because we are so subjecting our children to a devastating disease-causing lifestyle that it's starting to affect the youngest among us at this point. Celiac disease, allergies, wow, that's out of control, and asthma, which I had as a child. No wonder. I was brought up on antibiotics and non-foods. Now, this is exactly what happens to your villia that you saw before, the hula dancers that go back and forth, suck the nutrition, or in my old case, drugs, sugar, meat, whatever I was taking, and it takes it down there, and then it processes it through there. And as you see, the gut bacteria creates balance. But if you take the antibiotic, it bombs it. It's like putting a nuclear bomb inside of your gut. And as you see at the end there, at the very bottom, it creates inflammation that creates disease. And remember, inflammation is not what creates disease. Inflammation is one of the signaling messages of disease. It is doing things like taking antibiotics and eating non-foods and being stressed that create it. So when a doctor says, the holistic types love to spout this out, inflammation creates all disease, wrong. Bad living, bad lifestyle, taking pharmaceutical drugs create inflammation, which is a symptomology of all disease. Antibiotics in animals raised for food. Can you imagine people are still doing this? It's outrageous to me. I haven't touched an animal-based food for over half a century. Raised 4 incredibly healthy children, never touched an animal-based food. 8 grandchildren. And we watch what happens here at the Institute when people are wise enough and strong enough and smart enough, let's be clear, to get off this nonsense. Nearly half of all antibiotics are used for raising animals that some choose to consume. This is the sad part of the story. 87% of antibiotics used in raising these victimized animals are either never or very, very rarely used in human medicine. So now we have another problem. The human body, as I said, becomes adapt to whatever you do to it. That's why some people do horrific things for a long time and they don't immediately die. That the body has a way to, unfortunately, synthetically protect itself. But when you are now introducing a drug that was made for an animal, be it a steer, or be it a chicken, or be it a fish. Yes, fish have higher amounts of antibiotics than the first 2 I mentioned. Literally, now you're putting a real bad messaging within the intestinal tract that goes into the brain and the neurological system, and utter confusion and chaos occurs. And your body starts to have neuronal problems, and worse, it could start to mutate into cancer. Gut inflammatory conditions. So the gut inflammatory conditions themselves of our course been intimately linked to the microbiome, such as inflammatory bowel disease, celiac, diverticulosis. But this is what you begin before Crohn's disease, colitis. These are things that are so unbelievably sad when people have it, which are 100% correctable, by the way. I've never seen anyone who was sincere about getting well, who did this well and long enough, that wasn't able to reverse these things. As with all aspects of the microbiota, these associations are present, not just with bacteria communities, but for all other microbes, such as various aquatics and parasites in inflammatory bowel disease or potential via triggers in diabetes. How many of you know that there's a type of diabetes that's completely, absolutely created from taking an antibiotic? And many, many women who are pregnant and they go through the normal system and they're in hospitals and they take antibiotic, they tell them, oh, it's pregnancy that caused it. No, it was the drugs they were taking in the conventional way for pregnancy. We're going to start to see what happens in the world. The weakened immune system of the West. Now, to repeat once again, so you don't forget the point I'm making today, 80% of your immune system comes out of healthy intestinal tract, if you have it. 90% of your psychology, your emotions, come out of your intestinal tract, if you have that. So here's what happens. Prevalence of food allergies in preschool children is now at its highest level, at about 10% in the Western countries. It was so rare, I would see when I was a child, in the middle of the 20th century, somebody with an allergy. It was almost an enigma at that point. Look at this. But this remains just 2% in areas of mainland China. Now, why? Because mainland Chinese people live like they did 100, 200 years ago. If you happen to go into the big cities that they're westernizing, they're eating fast food, there's big problems. And the next slide is going to talk more about that. The number of new cases of type 1 diabetes in Finland per year is 62.3 per every 100,000. You say, well, that's not many, until you see a comparison with just 6.2 in Mexico, 10 times less. And look at Pakistan. They really live like they did 500 years ago. Less than 0.5% they have. And we all say, oh, we don't want to be around the dirt. Guess what? Seems to be healthy to be around the dirt, because a lot of your microbiome comes from the soil. And the cleaner, the more sterile we become. And a case point is Japanese people. You notice they were wearing masks before you were mandated to wear a mask. Why? They are so clean, so away from the soil, other than a handful of farmers that are there, that literally they don't interconnect with the very planet, the Earth, that is part of this system. We are not the elite who rule the world. The microbiome rules us. And we interconnect with all of these biological environments outside of us. Finland was so concerned about this because the problem is not only they have, type 1 diabetes, they have more allergies than other countries. They're sicker. There's more absentee from school than other countries. They did an experiment in Helsinki where they actually brought in soil, organic soil from the forest, and actually made sure the children 5 days a week for 1.5 to 2 hours played in the soil. And remarkably, within 6 months, these children had about the same exact ratio as Mexican children did, just interacting with healthy soil. How many of you have to go all of the time? And I don't mean number one, I mean number two. This is colitis, a form of inflammatory bowel syndrome, IBD as we call it. This is on an upswing like I've never seen it. It's higher in Western Europe by twofold. That's 100% higher amounts than in Eastern Europe. Now think of what I'm saying to you. Here I am in Eastern Europe. Here I am in Western Europe. I have double the amount of inflammatory bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, if I go from this border to that border. Why? Because they live in a very passive and natural way comparatively. Sadly, when we brought the money to us, we began to abuse our lifestyles with the money. Nothing wrong with money. You can use it for the right thing. What's wrong is what we use it for. And we somehow think it's uncivil to live the way our great-grandparents did. Seemingly, it's uncivil to live the way we are living today. And we have the data and facts to show that.